The rhythmic thunder of hobnailed boots striking stone pavement. It is a sound that echoed from the misty moors of Scotland to the burning sands of Syria. For centuries, this sound heralded the arrival not merely of warriors, but of a machine. A complex, living engine of conquest that systematically dismantled the known world. When we think of the Roman Empire, we often picture marble columns, the Senate, or the Colosseum. Yet none of that civilization could have existed without the iron wall that protected it and the iron fist that expanded it. We are speaking, of course, of the Roman legions. But how did a single city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, originally surrounded by hostile neighbors, develop a military force so advanced, so disciplined, and so structurally perfect that it remains the benchmark for military organization 2,000 years later? It was not simply a matter of courage or better swords. The answer lies in engineering, in a radical reorganization of society, and in a mastery of logistics that the world had never seen before. We will examine how Rome transformed war from a chaotic clash of heroes into a predictable industrial process. We will look under the armor and into the minds of the relentless machine that forged the Western world. Stay with us, for we will dissect the anatomy of this army, from the dirt of the marching camp to the brilliance of its command structure. To understand the Roman army is to understand the very nature of Rome itself. But before we reveal the secrets of their dominance, we must understand the crisis that forced them to change. For the first few centuries of its existence, Rome did not have a professional army. In the early Republic, the army was a temporary levy. It was composed of citizens, farmers, and property owners who would lay down their plowshares when war was declared, fight for a summer season, and then return to their harvest. They provided their own equipment based on their wealth. The richest fought on horseback. The poorest were light infantry. This system worked well for local skirmishes, but as Rome's ambition grew, this model began to collapse. Imagine for a moment that you are a Roman farmer in the 2nd century BC. You are called to fight not in a neighboring valley, but across the sea in North Africa or Spain. You are gone for years. When you return, if you return, your farm has fallen into ruin or has been bought up by a wealthy aristocrat. The backbone of the Republic was breaking under the weight of its own expansion. There was a shortage of manpower, as only property owners could serve, yet the wars were endless. The Republic faced a critical problem. It had an empire to defend, but no one left to defend it. If you were a consul of Rome facing this crisis, what solution would you propose? Write in the comments how you think you would solve a shortage of soldiers when the law forbids the poor from serving. The solution came from a man named Gaius Marius in 107 BC. He did the unthinkable. He abolished the property requirement. He opened the ranks to the capite censi, the head count, the poorest citizens who owned nothing. The state would now provide the armor, the weapons, and the food. In exchange, these men gave 20 years of service. Thus, the army transformed from a seasonal gathering of citizens into a permanent, professional force. This was the foundation of Roman military dominance. It created a body of men who had no trade other than war, and whose loyalty belonged not to the state, but to the general who paid them. With this foundation laid, we must now examine the core solution that made this new army invincible: its organization. The genius of the Roman army was not in the individual skill of the soldier, but in the modular nature of the legion. We must look at the legion not as a crowd, but as a structure, built like a wall of bricks. The base unit was the contubernium, a group of 8 men who shared a tent and ate together. 10 of these groups formed a century, commanded by a centurion. 6 centuries formed a cohort. 10 cohorts formed a legion. This modular hierarchy meant that a general could move vast numbers of men with mathematical precision. On the battlefield, unlike the barbarian hordes which fought as a single, disorganized mass, the Roman legion was a flexible grid. A cohort could detach, wheel, reinforce a weak point, or form a defensive square, all without breaking the greater line. It was a triumph of organizational engineering. Each man knew his place, his number, and his duty. However, organization alone is useless without the tools to execute it. We will now turn our attention to the key technologies and materials that gave the Roman soldier his lethal edge. While the enemies of Rome often wielded long, slashing swords or heavy axes, the Romans adopted a different philosophy of combat. We see this most clearly in the gladius, the short Spanish sword. It seems small compared to the weapons of the Celts, yet it was terrifyingly efficient. The Roman tactic was to stand shoulder to shoulder, presenting a wall of large, curved shields, the scutum. When the enemy crashed against this shield wall, the Roman soldier did not swing his sword, he thrust it. A short, sharp stab into the gut or groin required only a few inches of movement. It conserved energy. While a barbarian warrior exhausted himself swinging a heavy blade, the Roman soldier worked like a piston in a machine, stabbing and retracting, stabbing and retracting. Complementing this was the pilum, a heavy javelin designed with a sinister brilliance. It was not just meant to kill, it was meant to disable. The pilum had a long, thin iron shank and a heavy wooden shaft. When thrown, if it struck an enemy's shield, the soft iron shank would bend on impact. This rendered the javelin useless to be thrown back, but more importantly, it weighed down the enemy's shield, forcing him to discard it. An enemy without a shield was an easy target for the gladius. Furthermore, we must discuss the armor. By the 1st century AD, we see the widespread adoption of the lorica segmentata. These were strips of iron fashioned into hoops, connected by leather straps and brass fittings. This laminar armor was a marvel of mass production. It offered superb protection against downward strikes and allowed for a great range of movement. It could be stored compactly and repaired easily by replacing a single strip. It was the industrialization of protection. Can you imagine the sound of 5,000 men clad in iron and leather drawing their swords in unison? It is a sound designed to break the enemy's spirit before the battle even begins. But the true genius of the Roman army, the aspect that truly separates it from every other fighting force of the ancient world, was not found on the battlefield. It was found in the shovel and the pickaxe. We often think of soldiers as destroyers, yet the Roman legionary was primarily a builder. We will now examine the structural and design genius of the Roman military camp, the castra. Every single night, whether in friendly territory or deep in hostile lands, a Roman legion on the march would build a fortified city. This was not a suggestion, it was a rigid requirement. In the span of a few hours, thousands of men would dig a deep ditch, the fossa, and pile the earth inwards to create a rampart, the agger, topped with a palisade of stakes. Inside this perimeter, the tents were pitched in an identical grid pattern. A soldier from Syria could be transferred to Britain, walk into a camp in the pitch black of night, and know exactly where the hospital was, where the commander slept, and where his own tent should be. This standardization reduced chaos. It provided psychological security. No matter where the army went, they brought Rome with them. The enemy could never catch the Romans sleeping or unprepared. This engineering capability meant that the Romans could conduct sieges that defied the laws of nature. Consider the siege of Masada or Alesia. When faced with an impregnable fortress, the Romans did not just attack, they reshaped the geography. They built walls around the enemy to starve them out. They constructed massive earthen ramps, moving thousands of tons of rock and soil to wheel their siege towers up to the height of the walls. The message was clear. There is no mountain high enough and no wall thick enough to stop Roman engineering. If you were trapped in a fortress and saw the Romans building a wall around you, locking you in, how long do you think your morale would hold? This brings us to the internal systems and social logic that kept this machine running. We must understand the discipline. It was harsh, even by ancient standards. The centurion carried a vine staff, not for walking, but for beating soldiers who showed negligence. But the ultimate sanction was decimation. If a unit showed cowardice or mutiny, they were not all executed. Instead, they drew lots. 1 in every 10 men was beaten to death by his own comrades. This brutality served a cold, logical purpose. It enforced the idea that the unit was a single organism. If the line broke, everyone died. Therefore, the fear of their officers had to be greater than the fear of the enemy. Yet, there was also a path to status. A common soldier could rise to the rank of centurion, becoming a wealthy and respected member of the empire. The army was a vehicle for social mobility in a rigid class society. We have discussed the fighting and the building, but an army of this size consumes resources at a frightening rate. We must now look at logistics, materials, and labor. A legion on the march consisted of roughly 5,000 combatants, plus servants, slaves, and muleteers. This moving city required tons of grain, fodder, and water every single day. To solve this, the Romans built the greatest network of roads the world had ever seen. The Via Appia and the great highways were built by the army, for the army. These roads were straight, paved with stone, and drained. They allowed the legions to march at incredible speeds, sometimes 20 miles a day with full kit. And let us talk about that kit. We mentioned the lorica segmentata and the gladius, but the most important piece of equipment was the furca, the carrying pole. After the reforms of Marius, the baggage train of mules was reduced to increase speed. The soldiers themselves had to carry their own equipment: rations, saw, pickaxe, wicker basket for moving earth, and cooking pot. They carried between 60 to 80 pounds of gear. They were nicknamed Marius's mules. This reduced the army's reliance on slow-moving wagons and allowed them to strike with lightning speed. But within this massive organization, there were hidden systems, less visible but equally vital. The Roman army possessed a highly organized medical corps. The Medici were trained doctors who understood the importance of sanitation. They boiled their instruments. They used wine and vinegar as antiseptics. A Roman soldier had a better chance of surviving a wound than a soldier in any army up until the 19th century. Additionally, there was a sophisticated intelligence network. Specialized scouts, the exploratores and speculatores, operated far ahead of the main force, gathering information on terrain and enemy movements. The Romans rarely walked into a trap they didn't see coming. We must also highlight a special wow feature that demonstrates their mastery of mechanics, the artillery. The Romans did not just rely on infantry. They fielded the ballista and the onager, massive torsion-powered catapults. Using twisted coils of hair or sinew, these machines could hurl heavy stones or bolts with terrifying accuracy and force. During a siege, they acted as suppressive fire, clearing the enemy battlements so the towers could advance. It was the ancient equivalent of an artillery barrage, utilizing physics to crush resistance from a distance. Why do we not recreate this today? Why don't modern armies build their own forts every night or march in dense formations? The answer lies partly in technology, but also in the social contract. The Roman system relied on a specific economic model, one driven by conquest, plunder, and, unfortunately, slavery. The immense labor required to build these roads and fortifications was cheap and often forced. Furthermore, the absolute authority of the Roman state over the life of the individual soldier is something that conflicts with modern values of individual rights. We have replaced the mass of men with the precision of machines. However, the question of cost is interesting. How much gold do you think it took to pay, feed, and equip 30 legions? Stay with us as we consider the legacy of this investment. Despite the changes in technology, the modern relevance of the Roman army is undeniable. Every modern military academy studies their campaigns. The concepts of a professional non-commissioned officer corps, the centurions, of standardized equipment, of engineering corps, and of the supremacy of logistics. These are Roman inventions. They taught the world that wars are won by supply lines and organization as much as by fighting. They showed that a group of disciplined amateurs will always lose to a team of disciplined professionals. The Roman army also teaches us about long-term thinking. They did not build roads for the next year. They built them for the next century. They did not conquer for a season. They conquered for eternity. In summary, Rome created an army the world had never seen by treating war as a science. They stripped away the romance of the individual hero and replaced it with the reliability of the system. Through the Marian reforms, they created a professional class of soldiers. Through engineering, they turned the very landscape into a weapon. Through logistics, they ensured that their machine never ran out of fuel. They were master builders who could destroy, and master destroyers who could build. It was this duality, the sword in one hand and the shovel in the other, that allowed the Eagle of Rome to fly over the known world for half a millennium. They proved that while bravery is necessary, organization is sovereign. As we look back at the might of the legions, we must ask ourselves, is it better to rely on the brilliance of the individual or the strength of the system? And what would a Roman centurion think if he saw a modern army today? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering and history of the Roman war machine, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of the Roman military structure impressed you the most? And do not forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a journey into the past.